Hey everybody, I am Teri Lucas, and I am going to try something new here on Teri Lucas Quilts blog, A Quilters Heart. Um, I've been thinking about this for a while. A friend of mine and I had talked about it a while back, uh, and I thought I would just come in and say hello and tell you a little bit about what's going on. I've been thinking for a little while, I want to do some kind of uh, video vlog here on A Quilter's Heart to talk about faith in quilting. And as happens, um, there are, as happens, I get into a little bit of a funk in January, and it takes a little while to come out of it. Part of it is like there's a whole lot of things. I love it when my brain fully engages and all the words start tumbling out faster than I can possibly say them all. It is at once rather irritating and kind of funny. And because it is a hard time, I sometimes really struggle to find the words. The funny thing about this is the funny thing about this is like there are a lot of thoughts that live inside my head that I would like to get out. And I love writing. I love the act of writing. I love writing with a pen. I think my favorite pen, I actually misplaced it somehow, so I don't even know where it is. See, here we go. Over the last several months, over the last several months, I have read 6 or 7 books. Yeah, something like that. Part Generally when I am reading faith related books, generally when I'm reading books that I'm enjoying, to me they're sipping books, meaning that I will read them over time, and when I get to the end of them, I there's this sense of loss because it is though I have ended a journey with a good friend. And in one sense, I actually have. In the last since last September, the reading has been very specifically related to the Institute of Spiritual Direction here in the Austin Diocese. And I have loved every single book that we have read. Well, let me qualify that. I loved most of the books. One of them was a really big struggle, and it took me a little bit to not so much admit that to one of my mentors, but actually write it out. I'm not one for panning books because there's always something that you can get from a book, and there's always somebody who's going to love it. This one book, though, was a really strong challenge, and as a general rule, I don't set books aside. I might set them aside and come back to them, but I don't set books aside where I'm not going to read them. This is one I've actually set aside where I am not going to, in all likelihood, I'm not going to finish reading it. It just sent me over the edge. Title does not matter. In the last several months, there have been two things that I am reading, and I'm starting something else, which in and of itself is just what happens for the institute. And this is something I would have read on my own anyway. We have been reading Father Jacques Philippe's Interior Freedom, and the fascinating thing about there's always something really rich and dynamic in a book. There's something there. In here there's been a lot, and if I had my phone with me where I have the book, I would probably flip through and start like quoting things, or if I had my journal with me I would start quoting things, in part, really in part because some of these things have been really like they haven't shaken my faith. They haven't shaken my faith. But what they have done is shorted up. Um, It is not that my foundation was missing anything, but sometimes there are times when we need our foundation, like when, after so many years, we need to check our foundation and make sure that A, we're still where we're supposed to be, and then take that opportunity. Are there any cracks in here that need to be dealt with? Is there anything else going on here that is a good idea to deal with? Is there something going on that, like, is there something in me that needs to be removed? Is there something that needs to be added? Is there water leaking somewhere? Foundational issues. Really, seriously, foundational issues. And in this one, in any faith-related book, there's always something profound that it doesn't so much shake your faith as it does that shoring up. It is that place where we get to examine what's going on and take a look at what gets to stay, what gets to go. And as I'm reading Interior Freedom, it is not so much that things need to stay or go, it is a shift in focus. And I realized in reading it that some of my own definitions for things were slightly skewed. And while I have this deep understanding that God writes straight with crooked lines, and he certainly does. I mean, curly hair. The there is this, it's not so much the place of straightening out as coming to deeper understanding. And so at some point down the road, I will talk a little bit more about interior freedom. At some point down the road, I'll talk a little bit more about other books that we're reading in spiritual direction. And I will talk about journaling at some point. So stay tuned for some of this and let me know if, like, what you might like to hear. Now, I say that, and that's true. And here's the faith in quilting component to this. There's always going to be some connection. Over the last few years, I have had this uh, outside of work that I've needed to do. I've had a hard time doing my own creative work. I have had this kind of thing happen before. It is incredibly painful. It is sometimes physically painful, but it is incredibly painful because the thing that brings me one of the things that brings me the greatest joy in life is something that I will walk into my sewing room and to do something that I would love to do, and simply I turn around and walk out. And it's in one sense, friends, I'm showing up to do my own work, right? And in another sense, something is actually stopping me from doing that work. Now, in the writing over the last few years, I have actually hinted at some of this. Um, the it, and some of it is simply me. Um, some of it is life circumstances. We all have life circumstances, and some of it is not knowing what I want to quilt next. One of the things that I realized a couple of months ago, and I've been talking with a couple of friends about this on and off over the last couple of years, is a sense of grief. And that has actually come up in another blog or two that or podcast that I listen to. If I could remember where, friends, I would link to it. But sometimes we actually have to live in the grief of, in whatever grief we're experiencing, so that we can actually come to a point where we can let that grief, it's not so much about letting it go as entering into it more fully. When and I will tell you, once uh hmm, how do I say this? When I finally came out of the grief the last time, I ended up creating this really dynamic quilt called Shine Your Light. It is no longer mine, so I will put a picture up here when I edit it. It was not, it was a quilt made in memory of somebody in and in honor of somebody who I admired deeply and came this close to meeting. And if I hadn't given into in that moment my own sense of my own really twisted sense of unworthiness, I probably would have gone over and met her. It ended up being the last quilt market and festival that she was at, and she died shortly thereafter, and we still grieve her. Fast forward to now. When I wrote Color Thread and Free Motion Quilting and I knew what my publication date would be, I was all excited. This was not simply the fulfillment of a long-term dream. It was a deep sense of accomplishment that I actually finished something that I had longed to do for a long period of time. No one could have planned for the pandemic. And because of things going on in the background of my life, and I got something affirmed recently, which I'll come to in just a minute, because of some things going on in the background of my own life and the pandemic, the whole book launch, the whole book tour, the whole, everything that I had longed for in the publication of the book simply didn't have it happen. And at the time, because of some things going on in my background, I didn't have the mental bandwidth to pivot and go online the way that so many of my peers were doing. And I've come to understand that that is not the place that I personally want to go. I love being, because of what I teach and how I teach, I much prefer to be in person. Although, and because I teach free motion machine quilting and how I teach it, I much prefer to be in person because there are things that I can hear when we're stitching that I can't hear online. Try as I might. Part of it is because we necessarily mute what's going on in our own background so that it's not um so that it's not interfering with the main speaker, which is fantastic. I appreciate, as somebody who teaches and lectures, I really do appreciate that. But what I miss, so if somebody's stitching, because I can't hear them, what I miss is sometimes um, things like thread not being not going through the machine properly, or the knock 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 of the um of the needle, or uh the bobbin kind of um going a little cranky in the machine. Like there's things that I hear that when I'm in person that I don't necessarily hear when I am not in person. And so I much prefer to teach in person. And yes, we had that whole thing. Um, so what was a first, so I much prefer to teach in person. I can teach online. I can teach online. I bring my personality there, and my effusive, bubbly, you can do this kind of personality. I bring that with me, hands down. I can do. So I have my point of struggle, which is good. It's good to understand where the point of struggle is. I have my point where I am good at what I do. Doing that encouraging thing that I do. Um, but also and not knowing where I want to go and not being able to see that yet. And I know sometimes you just have to sit at the machine and do things. I realized just recently I am getting to the other side of that grief. Whatever, in some ways it has become new norm. And in some ways it's freeing me to kind of let go and go do a couple of other things, which means in some regard doing some video editing. While the video editing in and of itself is not, it's still difficult because I'm still having to like really think things through. Getting videos posted, it has been a little bit challenging recently. And one of the things that I love is talking to other quilters about what's going on in their own life. And part of me thinks it is, I am better behind the scenes. And in one sense, because my own temperament, I am better behind the scenes. One of the things that I have come to understand more fully, kind of not weaving, but kind of doing that quilting, stitching that I tend to do, that, that very intense kind of quilting stitching that I do, is that sometimes I do enough stitching that what you see is the stitching and nothing of the background. The background, when you're looking at a quilt, the background, uh, uh, I identify with background. I am great in the background. It's beautiful. It really is. Sometimes we don't want to see the background. Sometimes what's going on is foundation piecing, where it's not paper piecing where you're going to take it out, but it's something that you're actually going to leave in. And so it's something that supports. There is a product that R&K makes for Floriani, I think, that is a fabric support to beef up the fabric. And it is that right now, right, that has been, it is that kind of thing right now that has actually been, it's that which has been that thing that has led to the creative dryness lately. And and that's that's mine. um that's actually mine, and it's good, right? It's good. And I'm incredibly grateful that all of this has actually gone on. Part of it I will, what I can share is part of it has been about the move. um Picking up stakes after 28 years was a little challenging. Having to go through not only my own stuff, but some other stuff too. That was challenging. It was good. It was good. There were things that it was really good to let go of. There are things that I kind of regret not keeping, and that's okay too. I'm kind of working on replacing some of that. It, and there are other things going on too. And I am I appreciate your patience, both in the actual writing on the blog, because I do love writing about faith life, and faith in quilting, and how, for me, life and quilting is all kind of the same thing. And so I appreciate your patience, and I look forward to this new venture, whatever this is going to be, whatever it is. My hope is at some point to do some stitching here with you, and talk about what's going on. I may do a series, I don't know, we'll see, on John Paul II's On the Dignity and Vocation of Women, in part because it is such a dynamic and rich document. I may tell you a little bit more about Catherine of Siena. Oh my goodness, this uh talk about somebody who really knew who she was and who she is in relation to God. It was so beautiful, so beautiful. I may share with you some of the books that we've been reading for ISD. I may just do a whole series on, or I may just do book reviews. Interior Freedom is just incredibly beautiful. So stay tuned. We'll see where things go and let me know what you think. Drop me a comment.